Welcome back to Financial Fridays for expats and wannabes. Today I'm going to touch on some questions after last week's breakdown of the currencies, giving a 1 month breakdown versus a 1 month breakdown. And then showing how within 1 month there can be fluctuations and where could you be at with your currencies. So I'm going to touch on that. I'm also going to get into the currencies today. And maybe another topic, but I'm out walking around and it's the day before the market closes, so I'm going to touch on everything else first. A little ramble on the currencies. So to explain, I guess, a little bit further, because I've had a few questions on this. When I looked at the 1 month for the Canadian, because I compared the Canadian previous month and I'd saved that data because I'm Canadian and we're sending money. So I'm tracking it quite closely right now. And for those of you just joining us, I used to trade in Forex with a group of guys, and this is not trading. I'm not discussing trading. What I am discussing is how to manage your budgets with the currency rates. And what I hear from a lot of other vloggers, etc., is that, but Ken, it's already averaged at 42. No, and that's what I was trying to explain last week. What I was assuming is, let's say this is moving forward and your checks all arrive in such a manner that, based on last week, that they were always arriving on the 11th of the month, okay? That meant I could go back and look at each 11th for that month and break out an average. Now, because again, markets are going up and down, and we did have some 43s, some high 43s, but we had some 41s and 40s in there. And so that was my comparison. And what it showed was that the average for the month, based on the currency program, said 42.1. Now, so I used that number and I worked up, remember at the beginning, I worked up what the numbers would have been had you had 42, and that meant that in the Canadian you would have had 3,000 pesos extra that month to save, and the US would have had 6,000. But only using the Canadian as an example, 3,000 was based on that average that the currency program said. So if you traded every day, you would have averaged 42. However, if your check always came in on the 11th, your average ended up meaning that you only made 1,600 pesos that month. So I hope that kind of gives you a little bit better idea that just because the program says that this was what the average is, doesn't mean that is reflected in what you might have received had it been the 11th that your money always arrived. Okay, so because of bi-weekly monies, or you're being paid on the 15th and 30th, you're going to have a different date that it's coming in. The other problem that I see is that if you're not set up in your native country to receive your money and then you choose when that money gets sent, then you're going to be into this static, it's going to be this every single week. And that's been my main thrust of Financial Fridays, is to try and impress upon you guys that you have to learn a little bit about currencies. Not to say that the average of 41 is bad, because that is the reality of it with the Canadian dollar, that 41 is great. The US dollar at 50, anything above it is gravy in my opinion, because your average over a 10-year period is 50. The average for a Canadian is 40, and the euro is 57, etc., okay? And so that's what I'm trying to drive home here, is that you have to take a little bit control of managing that money. It's Absolutely critical. I can't express it enough. Now, to add to the other question that I had was, you're basing this only on me having $1,200 or 1,200 US or 1,500 Canadian to make that 60,000 pesos. Yes, I was working it backwards from 60,000. So let's say you're US and you have an $1,800 pension. Well, first off, if you're in the US and you're below 50 right now in the currency exchange, and you've got some savings, then you can send a little buffer there. And I'm only sending the $1,200. And then I substitute my already exchanged high rate money in to maintain that 60,000 pesos. But I leave all the rest of my US money in my US account in the Philippines, because you guys are lucky. You can put a US money account in the Philippines. Or I'm leaving it in my native country and optimizing on when to send that money when it's above 50, okay? Now, to those of you in the US, your currency is going to break down today, tomorrow, next month, next quarter, who knows, okay? But the main point here, guys, is you only have to look at history. The cycles repeat themselves, and it's critical. Save ahead. Every country, had they not saved ahead going through COVID, could not have maintained that 60,000 pesos. Now, in COVID, you couldn't do much anyway, so you were probably able to bring your budgets down to 40,000 pesos, okay? Because you couldn't go to the bars, you couldn't go to movies. Shopping was difficult, it had to be planned. So, but there are other regular economic cycles that do happen. And trust me, US, you are going to see 47 again, okay? There was a point where the US was at 40 and Canada was doing better than the United States. There's a lot of cross comparing where bonds are sitting, equity funds, the debt load on the country, how much is countrywide in mortgages. There's a whole formula that goes into determining who has a better overall debt to cash flow, GDP. There's so many metrics going on, guys. Well, it's officially Friday. Okay, so I'm going to now continue on. I'm going to do a couple of charts here to further explain why I keep harping on the savings side of things, guys, and trying to keep our quality of life continuing rather than worrying about where the currencies are. But that requires management. So if you're liking the content, guys, please like, subscribe, and comment. Okay, so let's get into the US dollar because it's a very good example of something that's been rising. But sometimes we need to reflect back. So here's a chart, the 1 year chart. And I'll get into why we've established the 50 as our threshold for the US dollar. Besides the fact that, of course, many Americans cite that 1 million pesos is $20,000, okay, which is 50. So here you can see that the low was 49, the high was 56, the average was 53. Now, if we'd have held with that 53 as a longer term, say averaging, that's all fine and dandy if you're doing like Lynn and I, where you're sending money in bulk and you're sending, say in our case, a minimum of 6 months worth of money. Now, recently, we were able to send equivalent to about 3 years worth of money, but big caveat, we had been saving ahead because in our dollar rate, that savings allowed us to bulk send. And now remember, we're only living there for 6 months, so that would have been 18 months worth of money to maintain 60,000 pesos and the quality of life that we want. So if you go back on this chart and you look, there was roughly 3 months, maybe a little closer to 4, where it was below or equal to that 50 line. Now, given that the low was 49, there was quite a few periods there where it was banging on that 49 pretty hard. Now, I haven't given the point whatever, okay? There's too much point whatever moves. Okay, so again, if you looked across here, you'll see that just above the word below is roughly our 50 line. And then we've had this nice long run. But if you take that nice long run away, you'll go back a little bit further and you'll see this clogging effect that was below 49. Now, I'm trying not to go into the COVID years too much. And so the net result is a little bit of this is to do with COVID, but not really. All you have to do is look back in history and you see a lot of examples of where it wants to walk on that 59 or 50 line. Okay, so again, just a quick recap here. Here's the 10-year chart. And the highs that we're hitting now require you to look at the 25 or longer chart to find this long-term resistance where the US currency is sitting now. And it's banged hard a couple of times on that 25-year high. So again, if we look across, the red line indicates the 50 and the arrows are showing how it bounced. It bounced along it, then it broke above it quickly for a short period, came down and retested the 50 again. Then it broke above it, came down, almost got to 50, bounced up a little bit, and then it walked along that 50 line during the start of the COVID, then dipped below it. But when it came back up again, it again walked along the 50, and now it's had a good break above it. Okay, so I hope that explains a little bit more why I feel it's so important to save ahead. And as I mentioned earlier, Lynn and I, we save as much money as we can in Canada. Now the US, because we're talking about the US with these charts, you're lucky in the fact that you can hold your US money in the Philippines in a US bank account or a bank equivalency, okay? And then pull that US dollar, so you got US dollars in your hand and you can walk down and get it exchanged. Okay, so there we go. That's a wrap on this week's Financial Friday. Please like if you liked it. Later, Gators.